how do URLs work and how do these resource locators work? Because we have a resource that has a location. That is basically how do you get it. So when we look at resource locators in web parlance, there are actually 4 kinds. There is the URI, the URL, IRI, and the URN. So how do these work? So the URI is a resource identifier. That's the almost top left part, the top kind of thing. This is the basis where we started from. So a URI identifies a resource, but resource may not be able to be retrieved electronically. That's the difference between a locator and a name. So a URL locator actually is addressable, that a computer can say, okay, I know how to get there over the internet. But there are also URNs, names that are not addressable. So, for example, an ISBN number. It is a unified and it's unique. That is the, if you go and look up, you can find what book that is. Then there is the IRI, basically that is to do with international character sets. So people who use non-Latin characters can still use them in their host names. And what they do is they translate those IRIs into URIs. So the IRIs gets translated and back into URIs. There are some real issues with that because there are certain letters that look exactly like their Latin equivalents. So there's some issues with, if you have a capital A in your host name or something like that, there you can find a Russian letter that looks exactly like it, but it's a different letter. And then you can do all kind of nasty stuff by people thinking I'm at the right address and they are not actually at the right address. So, so that's what IRIs are for, but they're not really that relevant. In this case, we are mostly looking at URLs, locators. So URL locators, they have a number of different elements to them. So we have the scheme. So what language does the does the system need to speak? What is the protocol that, or so? What kind of way do you get there? In this case, it's HTTP. You could also have HTTPS, but there are other protocols. Then, so the colon / is kind of not really interesting in this case. And we have the host name or the host IP address. So it can be either a name or an IP address, IP4 or IP6. And the host name then gets translated by your browser or your operating system into an IP address. And that's where it goes to make the request. But you don't only need to know which computer to go to, you also want to know what port that server is listening, because one computer can have multiple servers listening at the same time. We need to pick that. In this case, the default port for HTTP is 80. So if you don't put any port in there, leave the colon 80 out, it will go to port 80. If you have HTTPS, it will be port 443. It's not necessary to remember that, by the way. But then inside that we have a path part. So that is the, in a way, it looks like the folder of your resource. And it uses slashes, and the slashes are meaningful because of relative URLs. But in many ways, there is no requirements to have folders or anything for the path on the server. That's the convention, and that's how a static file web server normally works. If you go into a static thing, you just go to these paths and then you get your resources. But that's because the web server is implemented in that way. Then we have the option to add a query to a particular resource. obviously a query does not work with a static file. A static file has no aspects, but again, the query is kind of, on the service part, it's a convention. It could just say, okay, these different queries are just different files, but that's not how it's intended to work. It's intended to work as parameters to whatever program runs or functionality runs to provide that particular resource given those query parameters. And finally, there's a fragment which identifies a location in a particular resource. So the fragment stays in the browser and will never even go to the web server. Web servers don't care about fragments, but they will receive the query. So when a browser sees a URL, or it knows that something is a URL, then you can do it in two ways. You can use an absolute URL, so like we see here. Absolute URL will provide exactly everything needed, how you need to go, where you need to go. But a relative URL also exists. So a relative URL is based upon some other URL that it uses to kind of give the missing bits. So it will never fill in queries or fragments, by the way. Those are always, they're never filled in. It fills in basically your host name, your scheme, your port, and maybe your path. So you can have a host relative URL if your relative URL starts with a slash and then the resource name that you're looking at. So if you start with a slash, you're going back, it will not look at the local path. If you don't start with a slash or actually a hash or a question mark, then we have a path relative. So what it will do is it will look at the current resource name without any of the question mark or hash bits, and then it goes and it strips everything away until it sees a slash, and then it will use the name it's given and add that instead of the current resource. So this is basically, think of it like getting a resource in the same folder. That's kind of how it works. Obviously, resources and folders don't need to exist. Then we have resource relative. So you can make a request to the same resource if you don't even provide a resource name. You just provide a fragment name or a query. Those will be resolved against the resource. So a fragment will just look at the current file and will not even make a web request, a request to the server, because it knows the file. It just goes, okay, I need to move the browser window to scroll it that particular fragment is visible, like your regular HTML. When you make web service requests, fragments don't really matter at all. So when you have an application, what you'd have is your page URL would be the basis for those relative URLs. And if you use those, and because of the same origin policy, we normally make requests to the same server. Yes, there are ways you can make exceptions, and when you send a page, you say, oh, you can also make requests to that server or something like that. You can do that, but in our case, why bother? And so to make it work correctly, you want them all to be hosted through Flask effectively in your assignment. And in addition, you want to use relative URL so that if you host it on a different server or on a different name or with a different port, everything just keeps on working. And of course, your URLs stay nice and short as well. So use relative URLs to refer to your JavaScript or your CSS or even your resources, because they're just locations of resources on your server. We'll come back to how this works in practice when I'm going to go into PyCharm and have a look at that. We'll do that later.